Good evening, everyone. I'm Ji-Yeon Jo, the director of the Carolina Asia Center and faculty in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. Welcome to our second event of the Anti-Blackness and Alliance series. Before we start today's event, I have a brief but very exciting news to share. AAC and CSC will co-host an event on October 14th to discuss issues related to Asian Americans and the vote. And I'm really excited to announce that Congress member Judy Chu, the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, will deliver a special address for the event. The event will also feature documentary First Vote, filmed partly at UNC, and conversation with the film director Yi Chen, and the president of the North Carolina Asian Americans Together, Chavi Kunaru. It will be a timely event before the presidential election in November, so we hope many of you can join us. I'll now turn the floor to Professor Heidi Kim, the director of the Asian American Center, to introduce our series and speaker. Thank you. Heidi.
Thanks, Gian. Good evening, everyone. This is the second in a series of events entitled Anti-Blackness and Alliance, a series on Asian-Black race relations, which focuses on examining different facets of our interracial connection from an Asian American and global Asian perspective. This series is co-hosted by the Asian American Center and the Carolina Asia Center, and co-sponsored by the Sonia Haynes Stone Center for Black Culture and History, the Center for the Study of the American South, the Office of the Vice Provost for Academic and Community Engagement, and the Office of the Senior Associate Dean for the Social Sciences and Global Programs in the College of Arts and Sciences. With this series title, we are not suggesting that anti-Blackness and alliance are the only two modes of Asian American or global Asian and Black relations, or that they exist only as opposites. Rather, we are asking how these two ideas have governed public understanding and how we can deepen and improve the relationship between these two communities. For those who are not familiar with the history of activist alliance and political coalitions between Asian American and Black communities, we hope that our planned spring panel on this topic will bring new inspiration. But likewise, we need to interrogate the anti-Blackness that exists within the Asian community and understand how our implication in institutionalized racism limits our own lives. Affirmative action has been a battleground in this topic, and our own university was named in a lawsuit about race-conscious admissions. We are fortunate to have with us tonight an outstanding thinker who will speak on this topic in a talk entitled "Affirmative Action Isn't Jim Crow: Asian Americans and the Reconstruction of White Entitlement." Professor Iyko Day is Associate Professor of English and Critical Social Thought at Mount Holyoke College and a faculty member in the 5-college Asian Pacific American Studies program. Her research focuses on Asian North American literature and visual culture, settler colonialism, and racial capitalism. She is the author of Alien Capital, Asian Racialization, and the Logic of Settler Colonial Capitalism, published by Duke University Press. And she co-edits the book series Critical Race, Indigeneity, and Relationality for Temple University Press. Please feel free to post your questions anytime during Professor Day's talk. You don't have to wait until the end, and that will actually help us to collect them. Professor Day, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, and good evening. I just wanted to begin by thanking Heidi, Kim, Ji-Yeon Jo, Kevin Fogg, and Shui Lin for organizing and inviting me to this event, which is sponsored by the Asian American Center and Carolina Asia Center. I also want to thank all of you out there in the Zoom audience or Facebook audience for taking the time to join us. It's really wonderful to be here with you. So I'm going to start my talk by sharing my screen. So I'm going to do that right now. I think I need someone to enable it for me. Okay. Okay, so in my talk tonight, I have three overarching goals. First, it is to explore Asian American participation in anti-affirmative action lawsuits, which has been founded on the perception that Asian American applicants are placed at a disadvantage in race-conscious admissions policies, like the suit that's currently at UNC. My second goal is to explore the way Asian victimization by race-conscious admissions is being analogized as a form of Jim Crow racism. What's noteworthy, I think, about this is that it's kind of a novel version of a long reactionary tradition of equating affirmative action to anti-Black racism. For example, in the early 1990s, an anthropologist at Cal State Hayward described affirmative action as reversed Jim Crow. He was one of the architects, actually, of Proposition 209 that banned affirmative action in educational settings in 1996. So I'm interested in understanding or thinking about the history of radical struggle against anti-Black racism that is now being reappropriated or misappropriated for anti-affirmative action campaigns that are themselves anti-Black. And so finally, my third line of inquiry is to examine how the recruitment of Asian Americans and particularly recent Chinese immigrants into the affirmative action movement actually bolsters the reconstruction of white entitlement. And then I'm going to conclude with some thoughts about the serious limitations of affirmative action as a framework for racial justice. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Harvard anti-affirmative action case, about a year ago on October 1st, 2019, a federal judge rejected the claim that Harvard intentionally discriminated against Asian American applicants. The decision came in response to a lawsuit filed by an organization called Students for Fair Admissions, or SFFA. Who accused Harvard of four violations of the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment. First, by intentionally discriminating against Asian Americans. Second, that it used race as a predominant factor in admissions decisions. Third, that it had racially balanced its classes. And fourth, that it had considered applicants' race without first exploring, not race-neutral criteria. So in the judge's decision, she commented that Harvard's holistic approach to diversity wasn't perfect, but that race-conscious admissions were still needed to achieve the goals of diversity. This is the most recent of a series of cases that have challenged race-conscious admissions, and it certainly won't be the last because SFFA has filed a similar suit at your institution, at UNT, and also at UT Austin. But what's different about the Harvard case, as I mentioned before, is that it's Asian Americans rather than white students who were the plaintiffs in the case. In all of the other cases against affirmative action, white students have argued that they were essentially the victims of reverse discrimination. So the Harvard case is unique because what the Asian Americans plaintiffs are saying is that as a racialized group, they are also victims of a race-conscious admissions policy that hurts rather than helps their chances of admission. So while the suit against Harvard's holistic admissions policy was launched by Asian American plaintiffs, there's always more to the story. And so here, the person behind Students for Fair Admission is Edward Bloom. So who is he and why is he important to this case? First of all, you'll probably notice that he is not Asian American. So he's very important to this story because he's the president of the SFFA, and he personally recruited the Asian American plaintiffs in this case. So he is a longtime anti-affirmative action crusader, and he's been involved in the last three major anti-affirmative action cases. So he was the litigant in the case to overturn affirmative action at the University of Michigan in 2013, and he was also behind the two cases at UT Austin in 2013 and 2016. All of those cases involved white women who were denied acceptance. So although he's been unsuccessful so far at overturning affirmative action, he's been very successful in other parts, other legal arenas. So in 2013, he won a landmark decision that resulted in the gutting of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 by effectively terminating federal oversight of elections. So although he's not a lawyer or a politician, he's by far the most influential opponent of any race-conscious policy. And he's backed by wealthy conservative donors, and his primary strategy has been to flood the legal system with lawsuits. So in order to recruit students to his cause, he created a website called Harvard Not Fair and invited Asian American students to share their feelings of exclusion from Harvard's admissions process. The website includes a caption that states as follows, were you denied admission to Harvard? It may be because you're the wrong race. So the not so subtle implication here is that Black, Latinx, and Native American groups are the right races for the purposes of achieving racial and ethnic diversity on college campuses. So just before going any further, I just want to pause for a moment on these photos, which are featured on the Harvard Not Fair website, just to make a few observations about the way they invoke gendered racial stereotypes. So in the first image on your left, we see an Asian American woman. The fact that she's leaning up against a bookshelf and like clutching a book is clearly meant to sort of convey her studiousness. With her, pensive, vaguely kind of melancholic expression, she evokes the archetypal image of the shy, silent model minority. Of the shy, silent model minority, an obedient student who is also a victim. Because quietness is gendered feminine, her gender reinforces the sense of racialized weakness associated with her plight, which she is totally helpless to address on her own. Somebody needs to save her. In the second image on your right, we see an Asian American woman alongside two white students. You can't really see it very well because there's that thing blocking it, but there's another white woman behind the black box. The white man is the clear center of attention with his girlfriend's hand on his neck while the Asian American woman is discussing an assignment. It's not entirely clear who is helping whom, but the scene reinforces the value of studiousness combined with cross-racial sociality and proximity to white students. The scene thus attempts to challenge the stereotypical notion that Asians are antisocial and only hang out with other Asians. But this implies that the benchmark of acceptable sociality is defined by whiteness and that it should be rewarded. And I think this visual centrality of the white man in the picture really betrays the ulterior motive of the Harvard anti-affirmative action case, which is to use Asians to restore the privileges of whiteness in college admissions. Okay, so the other group, speaking for Asian Americans, a small group, in this case, are conservative first-generation Chinese American organizations. In particular, a group called Coalition for Asian American Associations also filed a complaint against Harvard with the Office for Civil Rights less than a year after the SFFA did. So they pulled much of the language from SFFA's lawsuit into their own, and similarly alleged that Asian Americans were discriminated against. What this group represents is a forceful mobilization of conservative, affluent, first-generation Chinese Americans against affirmative action. So they're mobilized through the Chinese language app WeChat, and so through that channel, they have made a huge splash through political demonstrations and lobbying efforts. Their primary achievement so far has been to strike down an amendment in California that would have reintroduced a consideration of race in college admissions. But I want to be clear here that the vast majority of Asian Americans in the United States support affirmative actions. However, the Coalition of Asian American Associations, this Chinese nationalist group, claims to speak for all Asian Americans. Secondly, their promotion of a Chinese first politics really distorts and reroutes the coalitional politics embedded in Asian American pan-ethnic identity to serve the interests of really only one ethnic group. political scientist Claire Jean Kim describes the current intersection of SFFA and the Coalition of Asian American Associations as the convergence of a nascent conservative Chinese immigrant nationalism with an older conservative white nationalism. So it is this toxic convergence that is really driving anti-affirmative action politics today. So the question I want to turn to now is how conservative ethno-nationalist Chinese American politics reinforce what George Lipsitz calls the possessive investment in whiteness, which he defines as the investment of time, money, and effort to protect and extend exclusive white privileges of asset accumulation and upward mobility. So in order to kind of explore this angle a little bit further, I want to kind of broaden the framework beyond just the Asian American question. So I'm going to broaden the framework of white entitlement to include the varsity blues scandal. And I'm referring to last year's admissions scandal involving celebrities Felicity Huffman and Lori Loughlin, who actually recently received a prison sentence. And so that case kind of really revealed the deep structure of affirmative action for wealthy white families in the United States. So coverage of the scandal has really exposed an even longer tradition of legal bribery in which rich parents routinely make large donations to colleges and universities where they want their children to attend, where they want them admitted. So recent scrutiny, of course, over Jared Kushner's acceptance to Harvard after his father's $2.5 million donation exemplifies actually the perfectly legal channels the wealthy have to exercise their power and influence. What the bribery scandal exposes, however, is the extent to which white wealth and influence is disguised within putatively race-neutral admissions preferences that far exceed those associated with race. So this means that athletes of aristocratic sports, legacy applicants, and those likely to help universities secure large donations enjoy much higher admissions rates than members of underrepresented racial groups. So largely white applicants of this privileged group accounted for roughly 30% of the seats in every Harvard class. Among those, that 30%, they are comprised of athletes, legacies, children of donors, and children of faculty. So in this broader context of admissions preferences, the spirit behind race-conscious holistic admissions can be sort of understood as trying to, counteract these examples of affirmative action for the white and the wealthy. So it's worth just drawing on one of these examples just to really drive home the extent to which admissions reproduce white affirmative action in college admissions. And here I'm referring to the role of athletics. Specifically, a major loophole that perpetuates both legal and illegal corruption is the outsized role that varsity sports play in the admissions process. And it widens the path to acceptance for predominantly white athletes in lacrosse, sailing, tennis, crew, water polo, and what are often characterized as kind of white sports because of the wealth or connections, required to join exclusive sports clubs and to have access to expensive equipment like a boat or, golf clubs or golf memberships. So despite the perception that Black students are the face of college athletics, the fact is that 61% of student athletes nationwide are white. 65% of student athletes at Ivy League schools are white, and 79% of student athletes are white in the Division III New England Small College Athletic Conference, which includes Harvard. According to a study reported on The Atlantic, at top schools, athletes gain 48% boost in admissions compared with 25% for legacies and 18% for racial minorities. Athletes are subjected to far less academic scrutiny than the rest of the applicant pool, to the point that non-athletes with comparative academic scores are admitted at rates that are 1,000 times lower. So the racial implications of this athletic loophole are no less profound for Black and brown athletes whose unremunerated exploitation in basketball and football generate the vast profits that sustain all of the other college sports. So these are the structures of white affirmative action that college consultant William Singer exploited by setting up an elaborate bribery and cheating scheme in which coaches, test monitors, and test takers doctored high school sports credentials, impersonated students, and fixed student test scores to secure admission for his clients' children into these elite schools. So one reaction to these cases, has been to lament the erosion of the ideal of meritocracy, which is the notion that admissions should be based exclusively on individual merit measured by grades and test scores. But in reality, as many studies have demonstrated, standardized tests are stronger predictors of family income rather than academic potential. And we've all seen the advertisements for expensive academic test coaching, which promise to boost your SAT score by up to 200 points. So this really suggests that SAT scores are more reflective of one's access to supplemental test preparation than to innate scholarly potential. So I want to suggest that the admissions loopholes for the rich and the fight for so-called race-neutral admissions procedures actually protect what legal scholar Cheryl Harris calls whiteness as property, which is based on the idea that whiteness functions as a form of property, a possession, whose value is written into law and reproduced in social relations. And I understand that it must, seem strange to think of whiteness as a form of property because whiteness is itself an unstable, social construction that has shifted quite dramatically over time. In the 19th century, whiteness in the US was associated with Northern European Anglo-Saxon identities, which meant that Italians, Jewish people, and the Irish, suffered persecution for being, not quite white, or what Matthew Fry Jacobson refers to as, whiteness of a different color. In the aftermath of Reconstruction, though, and xenophobic fears over Asian immigration, whiteness was gradually consolidated and by mid-20th century came to stand for all white ethnics, including those previously marginalized, not quite white groups. So the main aspect of whiteness that has remained consistent throughout this history is its exclusive character, its exclusivity. What this means is that whiteness is defined not by what it is, but by what it isn't. Whiteness is defined by the power to exclude. But I want to underscore that this exclusivity is not an intrinsic feature of whiteness. Rather, it is socially and legally constituted through the existence of a symbolic other, which functions to kind of create the illusion of unity among white people. So one of the reasons that I think it may be difficult for you as you're sort of hearing this is it's hard to think about whiteness as a form of property because whiteness seems kind of so intangible. Whiteness is not a thing like a car that you can own and drive around. Rather, it refers to the possession of a kind of social status. Another kind of difficulty of thinking about whiteness as property is that we tend to think about property as alienable. And alienable is just a fancy word that refers to the selling or transferring of property. So if something is alienable, I can sell it to you. But property law also covers forms of property that are inalienable or cannot be sold or transferred. So for example of inalienable property, I think the good example is, the university degree that you'll obtain here at UNC will be an inalienable form of property. Once you've obtained your degree, you can't sell it on eBay or transfer it to someone else. And just to give you a concrete example, let's say you become a doctor. If you happen to get divorced at some point in your life, your medical degree would be included as property when dissolving that legal relationship. So whiteness is similar in the sense that you can't sell whiteness or transfer it. But this very inalienability is indicative of its exclusive and thus enhanced value. Whiteness as property entitles its bearer to the right and to use of and enjoyment, reputational value, and most importantly, I think, an expectation of future privileges that are reinforced and augmented through the power to exclude. So historically, the courts have played an active role in enforcing this right to exclude, determining who was or was not white enough to enjoy the privileges of whiteness. These privileges range from the right to own property as opposed to being owned, citizenship, naturalization, the franchise, housing, loans, education, and a host of social welfare programs, including Social Security and the GI Bill. In the past, the reputation of being white was also treated as property. And so to call someone black, to call a white person black was actually to defame that person, and it could be grounds for litigation. So even if a person lacks material wealth, whiteness also serves as a kind of psychological compensation because it is the relative political advantages that extend to white people rather than the actual economic gains that are crucial to white workers. As Cheryl Harris puts it, not all whites win, but they won't lose by being at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. To put the value of whiteness and devaluation of blackness in stark economic terms, Harris references a 1992 study that asked a group of white students how much money they would ask for if they were changed from white to black. Most seem to feel it would not be out of place for them to ask for $50 million or $1 million for each coming black year. So extending this property logic to the Harvard case, we might look to the motivations of the SFFA president, Ed Bloom, along similar lines, as expanding the property interests of whiteness through an Asian American proxy or substitute. As revealed in the arc of his legal activism, Bloom's opposition to affirmative action or any race-conscious law that attempts to play a historically reparative function is motivated by a possessive investment in whiteness. Despite the presence of Asian Americans in the suit against Harvard, affirmative action is a threat primarily to whiteness as property because it challenges the unlimited right to exclude as a valid aspect of identity or property. So affirmative action creates a diametrically opposed property interest in expanded opportunity that is actually necessary to counteract the reproduction of undemocratic admissions policies that largely favor the ruling white elite. Thus, challenges to affirmative action reinforce the property interest in whiteness by safeguarding the virtue of original and inherited accumulation of property, resources, and entitlements. We can think of this as one feature of what Dylan Rodriguez calls white reconstruction, which he describes as a period that encompasses the post-civil rights era that is defined by the growth of white nationalism, white terrorism, and legitimized and normalized forms of state violence. So after Ed Bloom's failed attempts to overturn affirmative action by using white female student plaintiffs, as I mentioned before, he turned to and recruited Asian American students to function as a racial supplement to the claim of so-called reverse discrimination. In doing so, Bloom's organization seized on speculation that Asian Americans suffered a ratings penalty in the admissions process, then moved to construct Asian Americans as the most disadvantaged group in the United States. So what he did is the SFFA figured Asian Americans as doubly burdened by racial discrimination, and on top of that, being victim to these race-conscious admissions criteria, and they basically compared them, Asian American applicants, to Black school children, who are facing Jim Crow segregationists who are opposed to integration. So Claire Jean Kim gets to the heart of how these Jim Crow analogies misappropriate the history of Black struggle. She clarifies, that the plaintiffs are both trading on the moral authority of the Black struggle and at the same time displacing Blacks from their own history in order to end a policy that has significantly increased the numbers of Black, Latinx, and Native American students on American campuses. So the Harvard case is not the first time Asian Americans have played a divisive role in affirmative action debates. And I really encourage you to read more of Claire Jean Kim's work because she looks at this in a lot of detail. So, and as she has observed, the seeds of the Harvard case are actually apparent in earlier decisions, earlier affirmative action cases that date back to 1978. first with the Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. So in the three major affirmative action cases beginning with Bakke, Asian Americans have functioned to diminish the capacity of affirmative action to redress historical wrongs and their afterlives. So Kim describes Asian Americans, she calls them the spoilers, a wrench in the works that are destined to undercut affirmative action. And so just to illustrate this, the 1978 case, which involved Alan Bakke, he was this white plaintiff who was denied entrance into the medical school at UC Davis. He claimed that because a fraction of seats had been reserved for minority applicants, among them was an Asian American student, but he argued that this was a violation of his constitutional rights. And as an older applicant in the field, in a field that is known to be biased against older medical students, he was probably most likely the victim actually of age discrimination rather than any other factor. But what's important about this case, which seemed to have really nothing to do specifically with Asian Americans, is that the justices invoked Asians in order to discredit and limit affirmative action. By drawing on the anomaly of Asian American success, the Bakke decision transformed the objective of affirmative action away from historical reparation and replacing it with, the watered down diversity rationale, which remains with us today. So as Kim elucidates, the underlying assumption driving the decision is that Asian American success facilitates a denial of the structural oppression of Black people, and which includes a fantasy about a society of horizontal differences. So to put that a little bit differently, it presumes that historical discrimination against Black people and Asian Americans is equivalent. So if Asian Americans are succeeding, Black abjection really, there's no place for it. It sort of just disappears in the sea of equivalence. So the outcome of Bakke then was that race-conscious admissions was saved, but only after it was effectively delinked from slavery, segregation, and the expansive landscape of anti-Black society. So I'm not going to read this entire slide, but I just wanted to point you to another really important work of Margaret Chin, Oyen Poon, Janelle Wong, and Jerry Park, who are Asian American social scientists who have really examined this issue quite extensively, and they wrote an article somewhat recently. Here are 10 reasons not to fall for the Asian American penalty trap in admissions. And so they've gone through the Harvard decision and all of their admissions procedures to look at the way in which the SFFA sort of cherry-picked example and really distorted their holistic admissions process. So the framing of Asian American victims of an admissions penalty, can also point us to further problems with model minority discourse. While most critics of the model minority myth have questioned the notion that Asian Americans are model, drawing evidence that demonstrates that Asian socioeconomic status is totally exaggerated, or that it obscures Asian American poverty rates, or that it disregards from the fact that Asian success, varies dramatically by ethnic subgroup. For example, Southeast Asians who arrived in the US as war refugees have demographic profiles that differ really significantly from East Asians and South Asians. But perhaps more focus should be placed on whether the notion of Asian Americans as a minority is coherent. The usage of this term is extremely misleading, particularly given the demographic unevenness of the Asian American population by region. I mean, just as one example, California is a state whose majority is made up of people of color. So, are Asian Americans still, really minorities in that case? But more importantly is the question of whether it's useful to look at the United States in terms of a white majority and a set of minorities. The notion of a racial minority is a concept that ultimately obscures by rendering equivalent widely divergent histories of racial oppression and really screens off the foundational role of anti-Blackness and the colonial dispossession of Indigenous people in anchoring our social order. So I'd like to end tonight with some thoughts on Judge Burroughs' framing of the stakes of affirmative action in her ruling over the Harvard case. So in her decision, she defended the benefits of diversity and observed that it was not yet time to look beyond race in college admissions. Diversity, she wrote, will, quote, foster the tolerance, acceptance, and understanding that will ultimately make race obsolete, unquote. So the emphasis she places on diversity in higher education in many ways illuminates the more sinister aspects of affirmative action debates at Harvard and elsewhere. Because so much of civil rights discourse is focused on affirmative action, it leads the general public and perhaps Judge Burroughs herself to believe that, affirmative action is one of the main battlegrounds of anti-racist politics, and it's not. As Michelle Alexander, Angela Davis, and others have laid out powerfully, there are other issues that have far more damaging manifestations on our racial and colonial order than the affirmative action debate. So what affirmative action emphasizes is the idea that individual capacities, rather than racist and colonial structural arrangements, are the reasons that Black, Latinx, and Native people are subject to poverty, police terror, and disproportionate rates of incarceration. Despite the exceptional individuals like Barack Obama, who appear to have transcended the color line, it's important to recognize that the child poverty rate in Black communities is higher now than it was in 1968. Unemployment rates in Black communities are on par with those in third world countries. Suicide rates of Native American women have risen 139% since 1999. And Native women are part of the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. So rather than addressing or even being able to address those problems, those real problems, diversity-driven affirmative action sends the message that only some of us will gain inclusion, while ignoring those who remain at the bottom of the social hierarchy, regardless of whether there is a race-conscious admissions policy at Harvard or not. Okay, so I'd like to leave you not with a message then of like a diversity, but rather a call to commit to reparative, transformative justice, one that works to fundamentally alter the structures of racial inequality. And I think this sentiment is captured kind of beautifully on this, this famous rock that people spray paint at UNC Greensboro, which is on the slide. And it's commemorating the lives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. So of course, we can support race-conscious affirmative action, but understand its limitations as a movement for social justice in a period, that we're living in, of police terror, of massive wealth inequality, skyrocketing student debt, which is now actually 1.7 trillion, and also, at a time when our nation seems to be like on the brink of civil war. So the thing is, affirmative action can give the appearance of racial equity without fundamentally altering any of the structures that create racial inequality in the first place. Instead, it fortifies the value of elitism itself, for which individuals have to compete for inclusion in a zero-sum game. As Richard Thompson Ford puts it succinctly, he says, the affirmative action debates and scrutiny over admissions at elite schools is a symptom of a society that pretends that elitism could be democratized. So rather than attempting to ameliorate individual attempts to ascend a steepening social hierarchy, we might instead engage in a collective effort to abolish that hierarchy. For Asian Americans, this means refusing to be a pawn in the reconstruction of white racial entitlement and fighting for a more expansive, inclusive vision of higher education that doesn't depend on people fighting to death over crumbs. The insurgent message in support of Black Lives Matter painted on the rock at UNC Greensboro, I think is the sentiment that really defines our moment. It points us toward a goal not of restoring the neoliberal university and affirming our inclusion within it, but rather engaging in the urgent demand for a new and a different future. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Iyko Day, for joining us from Mount Holyoke and offering this really fascinating look at the underpinnings of affirmative action. As a Harvard alum and a UNC faculty member, you can imagine this movement and these suits have been extremely concerning to me. While our audience continues to put questions into the chat, let me start with a more general one that I think kind of touches on some of the questions that are starting to come in, which is, how would you frame the very common saying that Asian Americans are basically white in terms of a reflection on privilege and access? And how does that intersect with this anti-affirmative action movement?
Well, that's an interesting question to ask in this moment, because as we've seen with the pandemic, you know, and the rise of anti-Asian racism, it's really kind of been an interesting awakening, I think, that an awakening and a kind of brutal reminder that Asian Americans remain, you know, to the vast majority of white Americans to be these sort of perpetual foreigners, as people who are object of, you know, racist suspicion and hatred. And we're really seeing this in particular. The version of it, I think, that's especially prevalent right now is definitely related to the rise in xenophobia. That also, you know, President Trump continually stokes in terms of, you know, referring to the coronavirus as the Chinese flu, as the Chinese virus, et cetera. You know, and I'm hearing, you know, reports from my own students who've told me that, you know, just people on the street in our, you know, sort of small rural town have, you know, they've been yelled at to go back from where they've come from. So, you know, that part of it, you know, really, I think, you know, makes it difficult to see Asian Americans as white. And also when you think of just more broadly, when you look at, you know, where are the Asian Americans in, you know, elected office or in, you know, in corporate or public leadership or in popular cultural representation? I mean, that's the arena of whiteness. That's everywhere, but that is not where Asian Americans are. So I would say that that sort of, you know, counter challenges that notion. But I think that maybe the more important point here is that you know, while I'm saying definitely that Asian Americans face discrimination, face anti-Asian racism, you know, immigrant bias, et cetera, it is not analogous to anti-Blackness, right? And this is, you know, this is me, so this sort of draws on the points I was making, drawing on Claire Jean Kim's work, you know, and she sort of says, even the worst off Asian Americans, you know, those who are, you know, suffer from, you know, being a refugee or not having citizenship, being poor, you know, still enjoy, you know, the fact of not being Black, you know, in an anti-Black society. And so I think that's really a point that I would want to take, I want people to take home.
Thank you. We're going to start taking questions from the audience. And what we'll do to try to clarify those is I'll try to also drop them into the chat that goes out to all attendees. So one question is from Isabel L. And she asks, could you clarify what you mean by Asians helping to restore the white supremacy of admissions, which I believe is something you said when you were close reading those SFFA website images.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the point that I'm trying to make there is that, well, maybe I can just back up. Many reports and studies suggest that, you know, removing race conscious admissions will benefit white students the most, right? So so staying with that that idea, you have to ask, like, well, then why would Asian Americans, you know, how are they being recruited into this? And one of the things that affirmative action does is that actually creates a different property interest. That was kind of my point. It creates a different property interest in actually, creating more opportunities for people who are not white. And so when people like Edward Bloom want to remove that framing of that goal of affirmative action, it's kind of, I'm sort of arguing that it's a restoration of the status quo, which is where there's a kind of it protects their own elite privilege. It leaves that untouched and makes it, but it sort of hides it and disguises it as something that's race neutral, and in fact it's not. And the points that I was making earlier in the talk, where I was talking about, all of the, ways in which there are, predominantly white, wealthy applicants gain acceptance into these elite schools. They're totally legitimate ways, but they're not racial. They're just, they're about their elite status. And so what I'm saying is that, with Asian Americans trying to sort of, participate in abolishing affirmative action, actually, ultimately serves the interests of, reconstructing and reaffirming that sort of elite population that already, enjoys the benefits of that privilege at these elite institutions. Yeah, so I think that that's what I'm trying to say with that. I hope that makes some sense.
Thank you. Jian, do you want to bring in the next?
I'm going to relay question posed by Susin So. Could you address how Harvard and similar schools similarly redlined Jewish students, and if that is still the case or has been resolved? So I'm not sure whether you have some.
Yeah, and actually, this is a good moment just to further clarify my last answer. Yeah, so actually the SFFA drew on that very example to sort of create another analogy, like look at the way in which there was all this anti-Semitism at Harvard in the 1930s, et cetera. And so they were saying, so this is what's happening now to Asian Americans. Again, I urge people to look at the article that's just published in the Medium by Oyen Poon, Janelle Wong, et cetera, who really kind of unpack, really do a fine analysis of the admissions procedures at Harvard. But I think what I want to sort of emphasize is the idea that there is an Asian American ceiling, or that Asian Americans have been discriminated in college admissions is one thing. Let's put that over here. It is what the SFFA done is it's combined it with affirmative action. So anti-Asian racism, is an actual thing and has actually happened in college admissions. In fact, I will give you an example. In the 80s, there was another similarly named Asian American group called like Students for Fair Admissions, but they actually filed a suit against Harvard and Berkeley for discriminating against Asian American students. And it turned out they were discriminating against Asian American students at a time when, UCLA was called like University of California Lost Among Asians, University of Chinese Immigrants, there was all this, anxiety about the declining stature and status of these schools because of because of Asian American students. And so they were right, but what their objective was to reinforce affirmative action. So it's a totally different, strategy than the one we're seeing by Ed Bloom. And so the point that I would make is that by removing affirmative action, like removing the floor for students of color who include Black, Latinx, and Native American students, if you remove the floor, does it necessarily mean there won't be a ceiling on Asian Americans? So there are two separate issues. They're being conflated by, Edward Bloom in order to suggest that actually Asian Americans are the victims of these other students of color, right? They are benefiting from the victimization of Asians. So it's and whiteness is sort of like the invisible background to all of this.
Thank you for the clarification. Heidi, do you have next question, or do you want me to ask?
I think we can kind of combine a couple of questions that came in. So Kieran Ved asked a question about, whether Harvard does discriminate against Asians, right? Is there negative action, right? Which of course is different from not receiving affirmative action. There's also a question from Yu asking if there are promising strategy alternatives in college admissions other than the full abolishment of affirmative action. So questions about essentially how affirmative action or negative action might be implemented and what alternatives might be.
Well, okay. Well, I'll start with, the point that I made at the end of the talk by reminding everyone that, elitism cannot be democratized, as Robert Thompson Ford puts it. And so, we're talking about, these affirmative action and just admissions policies in general are a zero-sum game. And so they create all this tension because if I get in, then you don't get in. Like one person gets in, it means that someone else can't get in. And I will just say with Harvard in particular, I mean, last year in 2020, or this year, 2020, their acceptance rate was 5.2%. That means that almost 95% of applicants were rejected. I'm sorry, but anyone who thinks that they deserve to get into Harvard based on that extremely slim probability that you'll get in, it's kind of, I mean, that is a form of entitlement. I don't care who you are. You could be an Asian American, but I mean, that is, the odds are against you that you're going to get into Harvard. So that being said, I think that Harvard is usually used as a model because they have so much criteria that they, I mean, we would think that we would want to have an admissions procedure that considers the whole student, right? Not just, an SAT number, which again, many studies have shown merely reflect, a family's income and access to preparation, test preparation programs. So it looks at a variety of factors. And so actually, in many ways, Harvard has been kind of a standard. So I don't have anything specifically to criticize about their metrics. I think that a lot of people, though, what came out after the SFFA filed the suit was that there was this perception that Harvard had rated Asian American students poorly on their personal rating or personality rating. And this is, and I feel like there should be more media attention on exactly how that metric has been distorted by the SFFA. So one of the important things to recognize is that personal rating is not a personality rating. And many of the sort of words that were used, like quiet, studious, whatever, are words that appear, I guess, for students across all racial groups, And so the SFFA really cherry-picked their data selection in order to try to create this perception that Asian American students were getting this lower personality rating, when in fact their personal rating was lower than white students by like literally less than a tenth of a fraction. So there's no, so that is kind of like a complete distortion. So my point here is that there is no Asian American penalty at Harvard, as far as I can tell. For those places where there might be, which isn't to say there is an unconscious bias against Asian Americans in our society and in many places, the answer to that is to fight against anti-Asian racism. It is not to blame it on Black and brown students who have, who gain admission into these elite institutions. That's the point that I'm trying to make.
Thank you. So maybe I'll ask a question posed by Ben Greer. And he asked, is there a basis for class solidarity between Asian Americans and African Americans? If there is not basis for solidarity along a class paradigm, how can activists bridge the gap between the different experiences of a racial oppression between racial groups broadly?
That's an excellent question. And I'm really glad that somebody asked that question, because it brings it to mind a lot of different things. But I think that what we need to sort of understand is that affirmative action, while it takes up a lot of our, media attention, it's like, and a lot of focus has been on Harvard because it's this elite institution, there are more Asian American students in community colleges in San Francisco than in all of the Ivy League. So, I mean, it's really not representative of either Asian Americans or, Asian American politics. And by extension, any kind of, effort for racial justice. And so I'm actually arguing that we should sort of shift our focus away from affirmative action. Affirmative action are elite, issues. There are issues that involve students who are applying to places like Harvard, people who want to break the bamboo ceiling in, a corporation, that kind of thing. But those politics do not touch, are irrelevant, have no impact on someone who is living, in a crowded, impoverished place. It basically doesn't address the larger structures of racial inequality that are, that we're asking to be included in when we make these cases for affirmative action. Affirmative action is like the case, like, I want to be included into the structure, whereas we might want to shift away and think about, I don't care. This is not actually going to address, the fundamental problems in our society. I'm going to focus on, everyone should have access to education, and it shouldn't cost $75,000 a year. As I mentioned in the talk, right now, student loan debt is at $1.7 trillion. So basically the housing, subprime mortgage crisis has been transferred entirely onto the backs of students. So we have real problems. And so these are the things that I would actually urge people to, to mobilize around, and to sort of not see that affirmative action is any kind of primary battleground place for the vast majority of people.
Sorry, we're not going to get to answer every single question. We are doing our best to kind of go around and, give various ones a chance. I think maybe one last question. This one just came in from Anwish Anandi. And I'll just give the first part of the question, which is, how can policymakers and researchers reconcile the failure of restorative justice efforts done by universities through the flaws of affirmative action, which you spoke of during the end of your talk, performative anti-racist actions, etc., with the growing necessity of a higher education in the job market, which I think you just touched on as well. So how do we reconcile these two conflicting directions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and one that I, struggle with. I don't know if they can be reconciled, actually. And I know that there's time that's running out. So I mean, I would point the person who asked the question to look up abolitionist university studies. There's a whole new kind of genre of scholarly work and activist work around kind of transforming, the neoliberal university. As someone who is, a professor of English and, critical theory, I've seen in my time as a professor, all the funding in my institution going towards, even though I work at a liberal arts institution, really going towards STEM fields, and which I don't have anything against STEM. Don't get me wrong, but it's just an interesting dynamic where, it's gotten to the point where, these administrators who aren't teachers necessarily, and trustees who, again, are not teachers, are defining what our project is as faculty, as what we're doing in the university. And this actually came to a head, I think, when there was a governor in the South who actually proposed raising the tuition for any student who was not in a STEM field. Right? So we're seeing increasingly how faculty and students have no real control over what's being taught, who gets to teach it, and in addition, we have a situation where, 80% of faculty who teach in universities and colleges are not on the tenure track, who are contingent faculty labor. So, I mean, all of this is pointing to, I think, a radical, not restoring the university, but a radical re-envisioning and reinvestment in a different form of learning.
Thank you so much, Professor Iyko Day, for this very thoughtful talk that asks us not only to look at the anti-affirmative action movement, but also to really maybe question the underpinnings and the very limited way that affirmative action is able to undo, in a sense, the racial inequities and racist structures of our society. So thank you again for your time and for constructing this great talk for us. Thank you to everyone who attended. We really appreciated your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone, but I hope that this can be the start of a deeper conversation on our campus. I'll pass it back to Professor Ji-Yeon for some closing announcements and reminders.
Okay, well, thank you everyone again. I echo Heidi's comments about the wonderful talk that you gave today, Professor Iyko. Really, I sincerely thank you. And I'd like to close this event by thanking our staff members, both at AAC and CAC, for doing the outstanding work behind the scenes to make these events happen. And also thanks to our wonderful and engaging audiences for your thoughtful questions. And I am going to show you our next event. So we'll have, as I announced, next event will be Asian Americans and the Vote. That will have Congressperson Judy Chu and the Director Yi Chen and the President of NC Asian Americans Together joining us. And afterwards, Carolina Asia Center will also host a series of events. That next event is on October 6th, that we are going to have a conversation with Ambassador Kathy Stevens on careers in democracy. And on October 23rd, we'll have a conference, actually international conference on new inter-Asia mobility in higher education. So please stay tuned for other event announcements from both our centers. Thank you all for being here and hope to see you next time. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.